Recording.
Got it. Can everyone hear me? I hope you can. So welcome to today's webinar. Today's topic is going to be about localization, and we're going to learn about locales and what that means and how to maybe deal with this idea of different people in different parts of the world using the same app or potentially a different app. So in the previous webinars, I've been preparing a little outline and a little landing page and all that stuff, and I've taken a different strategy today, kind of as a test, and also because I was a little bit lazy and I didn't prepare anything in advance. So we're going to do this a little bit differently. But let's just have a quick discussion about localization, and we'll figure out like what does that mean. So I'm just going to write some notes here while we talk about this, and we'll learn a little bit about what is it. And I say write some notes. You'll see me just typing right in Xcode. I figured we'd be running in Xcode today, and we could do this in Android also. In fact, let me open up my Eclipse software so that we have both of these running at the same time. And what we'll do is kind of jump back and forth a few times, kind of as needed. I'll get Eclipse running in the background, and we'll start in Xcode, and we'll go from there. So localization, what is it? We'll talk about that. Why do I care? And is it tough? Is it tough? Is it hard to do? So we'll do that, and then we'll talk about different approaches in terms of assuming that you do want to localize your application and make it available to different audiences regardless of their language. We'll talk about some approaches to do that. So how do I localize an app? Question mark. What do I localize? So I think we'll probably cover most of the topics in those 5 things. What is localization? Why do I care? Is it hard to do? And then if I decide that I do want to do it, how do I do it? And and what do I localize in my app? So let's start with the what is it? Localization, generally speaking, means to create an application that will work in multiple locales. So locales, when we talk about locales, meaning geography, most people think of language. So we could be talking about English, Spanish, German, Italian, etc. So the good thing about these devices is the users, of course, choose their locale. It's usually set up for them when they buy their phone or their iPad or something, and they rarely change it. Very few people are going to change the locale setting in their phone, and I would be surprised if any of you have ever even done that. I know there's a little bit of a joke sometimes amongst the kids. Somebody will change the locale in their friends, iPod Touch or something, so that they can't get it back because we can't read it anymore. But the way that you do that is you go to settings and you just change the locale, and then it'll just kind of sit. So if somebody's phone is set to English, it's always going to be in English. If somebody's phone is set to Spanish, it's always going to be Spanish. So what it is refers to, is your application designed to run in one language or all of the languages? So that's in essence what it is, or a subset of languages, maybe 3 of them or something. So why do you care? You might care because you can get additional sales. You might care because you want to prevent a certain audience from using your app because it's only in their locale. There's a lot of different reasons why you might care. What most people care about in terms of developing apps is sales. And the bottom line is the bigger the audience, the more likely it is that you'll get downloads. So if you can support multiple locales, then you're going to increase that chance to get downloads and get more sales. And so is it hard to do? It can be. In some cases, for some people, it seems really difficult. It doesn't have to be difficult. Sometimes we want to make it a bigger problem than it really is. There are lots of tools out there and things that will help us. So it doesn't have to be that difficult. But more than anything, what strategy you use, the strategy, let's see if I can spell here, strategy you settle on will determine how hard it is or how long it takes. Strategy, I can't spell. Strategy, is that right? I think that's right. So again, the approach that you take will determine how difficult it is, how long it takes for you to accomplish it, and whether you're even going to be able to do it or not without maybe getting some help. So what are some of those approaches? So how do you localize an app? So from a technical perspective, it basically means translating, right? Do I need to translate everything inside my app from English to Spanish? Do I need to translate everything in my app from English to Italian? The answer is probably yeah. You probably do have lots of things that need to be translated in terms of from language to language. And so your skills in doing that, it might not be challenging at all. I know a lot of people in our community speak multiple languages, so they might be better off. Personally, I don't speak. I mean, I barely speak English, let alone something else. So, you know, I have a hard time localizing things because I need to either hire people to help me or I need to, you know, rely on someone else to do some translation, which brings up a good point. It's not as easy as you might think to hire someone to do translation because oftentimes you don't know the quality of their work. You can't, if you can't read it, you don't really know, you know, how it works. You don't know if they've done you a good service or not. So in the past, when I've hired people to help me translate things, I actually hire another translator to kind of help me quality test the first translated document, if you will. So how do I localize an app? The first thing is you have to translate it. The second thing is you have to determine, well, actually, we should have probably put this first, but one of the things you have to determine what it is, you know, what is it that needs translated? So think of it this way. Words, numbers, and content. When I talk about words, these are simple things like I'm typing words, right? In computer speak, we call these strings. In essence, generally speaking, all the strings in your app should be localized or translated if you're going to try to localize your project. Numbers, I'm just going to say all good. Numbers, fortunately, throughout most of the world, are consistent. A 1 in the United States is a 1 in China. Well, not China, bad example. A 1 in the United States is a 1 in Mexico, and so on and so forth. There are some Asian languages that isn't the case, and I'm just not even going to go into that because it's a completely whole different topic. But generally speaking, numbers don't need to be translated. Characters, right? We can put characters in here, and what I mean by characters are things like the $sign. You know, in the United States, this means $5, but in, you know, Germany, it might mean, I don't know, some other weird character equals $5. Does anybody out there know what they use in Germany? I don't know what the dollar character is, but those characters are very, very important. And so we're going to be needing to translate those characters sometimes, not the numbers, and then the content. Some applications have lots more content than other applications. And what I mean by that is if you have a busy blog online in a website or a busy blog online in an iPhone app or an Android app, you probably have lots and lots of content pages that might have, you know, thousands and thousands of words in them. And the approach that you take to translate that content is very, very different than the approach you take to translate simple words. And I'll give you an example. Let's run this application, and what I'm going to do is go to the configuration data for our app, and I'm going to break something so that we are to get an error on purpose. I'll break this by introducing a typo in our JSON data. I'll run this application, and it's going to give us a warning on the screen, a warning that I wrote that is going to show up in a little alert message. And we've all seen this before, but I wanted to demonstrate something here that'll help us understand some concepts about translating simple words or localizing some simple things, which is not related to content. And so this application right here, you know what, let me reset this simulator. This application, I introduced an error, but it's running off of a, let me reset this. reset content and settings. I got to delete it because I was running an older version. So I've got an error in the JSON data, and what I'm going to do is run this just like we did before. I should have done this. I should have cleared it before, and we'll get it to introduce us an error. Okay, so this message on the screen says that the configuration data for this application is invalid. So that is clearly in English. So if this application were running in a device that had, say, Spanish set up as the language, then this wouldn't be the appropriate message to send or the appropriate message to show. So that's going to take us to our first strategy. What could I do? Let me find here my notes I was just writing. Where are our notes? Anybody remember what file I was in? I think I was in, yeah, here we go. I think I was in, here we go. You know, how do I do it, and what are some of the approaches to localizing an app? So the first thing that we could do is we could make a different app. So one approach one, make an entirely different app. And this is not necessarily a bad approach. There are some cases when this might be a good idea. For example, maybe you don't have time to localize your app and you want to get it in the market, and you've only done it in one language, and you're not going to wait around for months or weeks or even days sometimes, and you just want to publish it. So you could publish your application, and then you could come back and you can make a different application for the different language. Not a very common approach, but it does happen. And so the other approach that we could make is we could use a local strings file holding language text. So a lot of you guys have seen this file in your project. It's called localizable.strings. And you'll see that it has what I call a key and a value. A key and a value. This is all in English. So if I was going to make a Spanish version of this, the key, back, next, done, okay, all these values on the left would not change. But the value on the right would be literally in Spanish. So I'll give you an example of what I mean. The configuration data for this application invalid is the message, and this message is coming from this strings file or this localized language file. So what I can do is I can find, let me find it here. I'm just going to search for it. Yeah, the configuration data. Configuration data for this application is invalid. So the name of the key in this file is app data invalid, and the name of the value of the message is that. Do we have anybody from a different country watching? I don't see the attendee list in terms, it doesn't show me where they are. Let's see. Miguel's in there. Miguel, what would that say in Spanish? Can you paste that in the box? The configuration data for this application is invalid. How would we say that in Spanish? Let's see if we can get him to reply. If not, then I'll just make something up.
Hello? Okay, Miguel is Portuguese, but I've unmuted his microphone, so Miguel, go ahead.
Can you guys hear me?
We can. So how do you say the application or the configuration data for this application is invalid in Spanish?
Okay, well, I can say it in Portuguese. I'll type it here, okay?
Okay, perfect. Portuguese.
Okay, yeah. Give me a second then.
Okay, no problem. I'm going to look at something else while we do this because it's kind of interesting. And this is just me, you know, kind of having fun with this. There's a lot of different ways to do it. So what I'm going to do while we wait for Miguel to paste that for us is I'm going to go back to this .m file, and I'm going to show you where we're pointing to this string. We're pointing to this key, app data invalid, in a few different places. Aha, we got it. So I'm going to copy this, and I'm going to go back to my strings method here, and I'm going to paste in this value in Portuguese. I won't even try to say it. And I'll run this application again, and I'll show you that this message right here is now showing in Portuguese, not because I pasted it into the actual code. The code that's showing that message is in our delegate file, in a few different places, and you can see here where it says ns localized string. What we're saying when we run this ns localized string method is, hey iOS, go to my localized strings file and find the key here called app data invalid, which we just changed, still called app data invalid, but the value of it is now in Portuguese. So everywhere we call that method, we're going to get that Portuguese value. So we did it here, we did it here. If I search this file, we've done it actually only in those two places. So you might be wondering then, what is this English next to it? The English next to it is the value that we're going to show if this key does not exist in our localized strings file. So let me demonstrate that. If this key did not exist, for example, I spelled it wrong, I'll just do it like this. If the key does not exist in our localized strings file, it's going to show us the name of the key, and I could set up my project to also show us this default value. And so there's a couple different ways to do it, but the most common way is to set up a key, a value, and then instead of just hand typing in the words we want to use, we run the localized string method and ask for the value of this key. And we do that throughout the core code in lots and lots of different places. So the next logical question is, and you might be asking yourself, why do we have a Portuguese value here and an English value here? And the answer is we shouldn't. I'm going to replace this back to the English version. And I'm going to run this app again to show you that we're going to go back to the English version. And the reason that I did that was just to demonstrate to you that we're pulling the value from this file and not the code. And lots of the plugins do that, right? Like if we go to, I don't know, my old school URL menu, and we search for ns localized string, you'll see that in this file we're using a key called no local data available from the strings file, which is up here, and no local data available is right here, and this is the message that you guys are used to seeing, right? Data for this screen has not been downloaded. Please check your internet connection. So we didn't hand type that here. Instead, we told iOS to go look at our localized strings file. So what if we want to have two strings files? How do we do that? Well, one way to do it is just to ask iOS to create us a new file. I'm going to say new file, and I could put this in any folder. And we're going to get our classic, new file dialog open here. And we're going to do this strings file, and I'll say next. And I could name this file. Let me find the other project here. See how we have an English project? I don't want to put it in my English folder, which, by the way, we don't see here in the configuration data, that folder. Xcode kind of hides that from us. And so it gets a little bit tricky in terms of where do we put it. So I'm just going to put it in the configuration file here. I'm going to call it localizable, excuse me, I'm just cheating a little bit and looking on my left, localizable.strings. I'll save it here, and there it is. Oh, it did it for me. I better rename this. It's been a while since I've made one of these. We're going to add a new file to our project, and then what I can do is I can ask iOS, see if I can remember how to do this. I can ask iOS to make this, recognize this as a Spanish file. And you know what I'm going to need to do? Let me delete this. I went about this the wrong way. Sometimes you can't rely on your memory. Let's jump over here on Google. Just that way I don't have to look it up. It's faster sometimes. We'll just say iOS localized strings file. How to localize an app. I'm just clicking the first one. Oftentimes you're going to go down to this stuff and you're going to learn how to do it. And it's going to talk about the localized string, and it's going to talk about how to get it, everything that we talked about. And it's going to talk about how to make a new one. So we've got an English folder and a Spanish folder. And inside those folders, you're going to see each of these localized strings. So rather than go through that whole process, the message here is, and the thing to understand is you can easily create another one of these files You usually do it by copying this file, and then you would just change the right-hand value for each of these strings. And so I think most of us can understand how that works. But back to our little notes here, that's only one approach. Where were my notes? I'm losing them here. I should have probably figured out where they were before I jumped around. I had them in the delegate. Anybody remember? Oh, here they are. Okay, I'm going to note to self, line 267 is where our comments and our outline starts. So words and strings and characters can be localized in the one single strings file, and you would have multiple versions, multiple strings files in your app project. And what would happen is iOS, instead of choosing your English version, when we called on that string value, instead of choosing your English version, like in this method here, do you notice it doesn't say go get the English version? It says go get the localized string. And that would mean figure out what language the user has their phone set to, find the appropriate file that we localized, and find the key called connection error. So that's how we would localize single, simple statements and words, and you can get away with a lot of stuff in that regard. And so let me fix the errors on this configuration data so we can launch our app.
David.
And we'll take the next little approach here, and we'll talk about how do I do numbers and characters. You might be asking yourself, and dates and things like that. Oh, it's still invalid. You might be asking yourself, how do I localize something like the pound sign? So the pound sign, or the pound character, is a little bit different because we generally don't show those in our localized strings file because it's very rare that you would know, in some cases you might have something like price of product, right? And you could do like $, $5, and you could have a different localized strings file with a different character here like pound. I don't even know how to do the English pound on my keyboard, but in most cases this is a bad idea with numbers because numbers tend to change. Numbers come from other places. For example, if you're doing in-app purchase type stuff, the price of the product probably comes from Apple that you set up in your control panel, or maybe you're doing a calculation. You don't know the price of the product in advance. So in that case, oftentimes we'll want to determine what language is running on the device. And so we could do that by asking iOS what language you are, or what locale are you. And we could do that pretty simply with a couple of lines of code. We could get a locale object, and then we've called locale. And then we said, hey iOS, what's your current locale? And then we could say language, and just for fun, let's print the language that this simulator is running. And we can show you, let's see here in our control panel, what language are we running? What language? And I'll print this using our little debugger, the language that we asked iOS for. See my little chat windows jumping around. Leon has a question. What's up, Leon? Can you type in the box, or do you want to ask about it? Go ahead.
Leon's unmuted. Go ahead, Leon.
And Warren, I can barely hear Warren. You're jumping around on your microphone also.
David, can you hear me now?
Perfect.
Okay. Yeah, Leon, I tried to get Leon's attention. Leon is unmuted.
Okay.
He says, yeah, Leon, your microphone is unmuted if you want to ask your question.
Oh, no, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, I can hear you well.
Oh, you can. Okay. I just wanted to go to the localizable strings. You can do that way easier. Maybe that's important for the other bus touch guys. If you go to, well, David probably knows, but he just can't remember. If you go to the project info, David, if you can just do that.
Yep.
Yeah, right there to the project info. Yep. Then you get the point localizations. Just go to info and go to localization. Go to project, not on targets, but on projects.
Yep.
Yeah.
Project info localizations right here, exactly. Then we can add a new one.
And if you do the plus there, then you just choose your language, and then all that stuff is automatically done, and then you can just translate right away.
Perfect.
So
Great tip. Great tip. And let's do that to show the audience what gets created. Because what's going to end up happening is we have in our localizable.strings, you see we have two files now. We have English and we have Spanish. And so, and also the interesting thing is you notice it already duplicated that file for us. We would have to translate the values, but the file is already there. Great tip. And you can do that manually, or you can use Interface Builder, or you can use the Xcode environment like Leon just pointed out. That's an awesome tip. And you're right, I hadn't remembered that it was that easy. Guys like me, I just kind of hammer out old school sometimes. So cool. So we could do that with as many languages as we wanted. And to recap, what we just did is we went to our project, and then we went to the info setting, and then we went to the localizations node or section and expanded it, and then used the plus button to choose the language. And you'll see here that each time we did that, it added a localizable.strings file for us that's based on our first one. And I don't remember, Leon, you might remember, is it copying the only one in our project, or is it copying, there must be a default or something? Can't remember, and I'm not sure if Leon's microphone.
There's a default one, yeah.
Yeah, there's a default.
There's
Perfect.
a default one.
So great tip. It's a great tip. So back in our project, in our delegate, all I did in our code here is I said, hey, what's the locale of the app that's running? What is the language from that locale? So display name for key, and its locale identifier. And then we got the locale identifier. And then we used the debugger to print it to the console when the app launched. And that value is right here in our console. And you'll see it says what language. And then I put the little %, which is a placeholder for this string here, the language. And so the formatter put the language there. And you can see in our console it says English United States. So for fun, what if I went to my settings in my simulator, and I went to General, and I went to International, and I chose Spanish, Italian, Dutch, English, Espanol, done, and I relaunched this application. I don't even know what that means. I wonder if this will work on my simulator. Does anybody know if the simulator's got different locales built in? I'm not sure. But let's find in our console here the same output and see what it says.
Miguel says that it does.
It does. Okay, cool. I don't speak anything. I'm just an English guy, so I'm kind of stuck in that regard. But let's find here what language. There we go. So it says Inglés with a little, I don't know what that's not a tilde. I can't remember what that's called. Accent character over the E. But it changed. So that's the locale, and we can change that in our simulator. And all we would be doing is changing which one of these strings files we're pointing at. I'm going to go back to English so I don't totally ruin this chat, because I'll be lost. It's a good thing I didn't choose like Spanish or something. I mean Chinese or something. So now it's black. I wonder why. Let me reset the content here. Now that I've completely locked us out of the. Maybe I need to quit the simulator. General, International. Okay, we're back to English. I survived that little example. Ha! That gets kind of fun sometimes. Let's get our app going again. Did our app even have anything on the home screen? I don't remember. But anyway, so that's how we make localized strings files. But that doesn't solve all of our problems. That only solves simple problems. So we need to get back to this idea that we can test which locale is running on the device, so that then we can make some more sophisticated decisions. And I'm pretty confident that I'm going to lose a lot of you guys with the next thing that we're going to talk about. But it's going to be related to localizing the content. And Miguel and I have had a couple of emails back and forth over the last few weeks, and we've been trying to find some time to get together, and I was going to show him this approach. But I'll try to show all you guys at once so that we can kind of all learn from it. And if I don't introduce more confusion and more problems, then we'll just consider ourselves lucky. I think I'm going to lose some of you, but we'll do the best we can.
David, before you go any further, Susan's got her hand up.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah, how does it work with languages that use a different type of text, like Russian or well, of course Chinese or something. But how would it work like in Russian where they have I don't know if it's even letter for letter, but they have I think it's Cyrillic alphabet maybe.
Yeah, that's a good question, Susan. We might get some help from some folks watching or whatever. But the assumption that I'm going to make, because I don't have a Cyrillic keyboard or a Chinese keyboard, the assumption that I'm going to make is that those characters would be typed here, and the key would be still called the same thing, but the value would be that strange text that you and I don't understand in that one localized strings file. And because iOS understands all the different character sets and the user has chosen their language, then it would then also understand how to get the, how to read the values. Now the interesting thing also is you and I, because we don't have the special keyboard or don't understand how to make those we don't know how to translate. I can only assume that I would email this file to someone and then they would translate it and send it back to me.
Oh, and it had the text built in, and maybe
exactly.
you could.
Because,
I don't know. Could you read it? Could you see it? Read it on your own computer? Probably not. It would just look like garbled, but
yeah, it would definitely display it for us. I mean, we're all Unicode, UTF-8 character sets. That's fine, but we wouldn't. Okay. We just wouldn't know how to. We wouldn't know what it meant.
No.
And that's where I say, you got to trust your translator.
Yeah. Okay.
And sometimes it's good to have two. I mean, I don't know. Maybe it depends on how much you pay them. Or in our community, we've got a pretty big audience. We might. And I know in the past I've seen some forum posts, people translating this exact file, and sometimes, and I've done a pretty poor job listing those, on the site or whatever. But, as a group, because there's so many of us and there's such a global audience, I'm sure that we could localize this one file that comes with all our apps pretty fast. And it doesn't.
That's a good idea.
Yeah, and it doesn't necessarily mean that all of the plugins are going to honor those. And it doesn't necessarily mean that one of your plugins would, not just be in English, but it would be at least for a start for all of the core things that, all the alerts and messages and things like that.
Yeah. In my own life, I did a lot of work with translations. We had to translate everything into like 13 languages in a Medicaid program.
Right.
But it really how you do it. It depends on how the importance of the language. If it's very important, like healthcare language, you got to get it checked. But if it's something that's not that important, maybe you take a risk.
Right. And the one thing that I learned a couple of years ago when I was making apps for money before I started, focusing on this, unfortunately, I would localize something and I would introduce it in a market, and then it would create questions and emails and a dialogue between me and my customers.
Oh,
and I couldn't have that conversation. And so I was almost worse off by trying to support them because I introduced this relationship that was in essence useless because I couldn't communicate with them. So
there's a lot to think about, really. It's not just a translation, it's a whole package.
Right. And a lot of people don't realize, like, look at this title row up here. You see the refresh button with the symbol on it? It's easy to overlook the idea that that's international. That symbol helps any language understand that that's the refresh button. And you'll see lots and lots of apps with words on the screen. And iOS uses words too, like edit and done on buttons. But a lot of their buttons are graphical, these icons on purpose so that they can avoid these very basic things that are easy to overlook.
That's true.
Okay, so what are we going to do though when we have special things that we want to determine the language on the fly before we getting back to Miguel's challenge? And really, a lot of people have brought this up. How do we fundamentally show them different content? So the example would be, let's say that we had an HTML document. We were using the HTML plugin, and we had a big long blog post that was in English. Well, iOS is not going to automatically translate our blog post into Spanish. So we could successfully localize the basic values using the string files, but we couldn't localize the content using that approach. So how could you do that? And we could go back and create a different app, that's for sure, but then we'd have two different things in the App Store, and we'd have, where do you draw the line with that? So one of the approaches that I used in the past, and this is complicated, but I'll do the best I can to explain it, is instead of having one configuration file, we call it btconfig.txt, instead of using one configuration file, We could use 2 configuration files or 3 configuration files. And a lot of people don't realize this, but this file does not have to be named that. I can change the name of this file to something like that, right? btconfig.english. I can go to the project and I can copy this and I can make another one. Let me just give you an example here. Let's do new file. And I'm just going to do where do I just do a plain text file? I always forget. Empty file. So I'll call this btconfig, and I could name this anything I want. Spanish.text. And what I end up having here are 2 files with different names. I'm going to copy everything inside of the English file, and I'm going to paste it in my Spanish file. So in essence, these are the same files now. So this is the English file, and this is the Spanish file. So we've introduced a couple of problems here that we're going to fix here in a second, but I just wanted to talk about my idea and this strategy that I'm using. I could go to my control panel, my BuzzTouch control panel. If I'm using the control panel, you could do this manually if you'd like. But I could go to my control panel and I could look at the application ID and the API key for this app and set its data URL, just like I get when I download my project. And I could go and I could create another app, an entirely different app in my control panel, which might be called, Project Spanish or Project English. And I would then get a different ID and a different API key and a different data URL. So I would use those values and that configuration data. I would copy the whole file from my control panel for my Spanish app. So if that makes sense, then we can continue on. I'm hoping I didn't lose a bunch of you there, but my point is you can have multiple configuration files in your app when you compile it. So if you can get your head around that, you would be then going to multiple apps in your control panel to manage the content associated with each of these apps. This would be a totally different ID, and this would be a different ID, and the URL would be a different ID. So if you can understand that, then you might be asking, well, how will the application know which configuration file to use? And that's where we would test which locale are we using before we decided which configuration file to use. I guess I see I have a double underscore there. Okay, so I fixed that. So if you guys have ever dug through this, you may have noticed at the very top it says, set the configuration file name. What is the configuration file that we want to use? It doesn't have to be named bt_config.txt. That's just a name that I chose a long time ago to help us all understand the purpose of that file. We could easily say configuration file name equals btconfig english.txt, just like that. And the app will behave in the same way. Looks like, do we have another question maybe? Not sure. But anyway, we got a few minutes to go. So the strategy here is mostly going to apply to Miguel, or specifically apply to Miguel, but all of us will understand this, I hope, is in the beginning of our app, when it first launches, and our delegate file did finish launching with options, we can change the name of the configuration. We could then, and like we could assume that it's English, for example, we could then test the locale, and go back up here. We could then test the locale, and we could say something, and this is going to be rudimentary, but you'll get the idea. If language is equal to string Spanish, and you'll have to test exactly what iOS calls them. It might be the 2-digit code, it might not. If it's Spanish, then our configuration file name is Spanish. So we could do as many if statements as we wanted down here. We could do all kinds of strategies. This is just a simple example of how we could use multiple configuration files in the same app to produce different content, some in Spanish, some in English. If that makes sense, then you might experiment with that process. What you'll need to do, though, is before you publish your app, after you download your source code, you'll have to add this logic, of course. You're not going to be able to do this with the control panel. And we've experimented with a lot of different ways to allow you to manipulate languages and localization values in the control panel, and what we found is almost always it just doesn't work as well as kind of doing it yourself, because there's so many different variables that we can't think of. It's really challenging. And so one of the joys of the control panel is you can easily just make another app and provide completely different content. So that's kind of where we've been going. I'm going to open up the Eclipse console real quick. This is of the Android project running the same thing, and I'm going to show you in the Android project basically the same approach could be taken. Starting with the localizable strings file, you have resources and you have values. This strings.xml file is our, quote, English version of all those same types of keys and values. So you could create another localized strings file and localize it with Android or with the Eclipse development platform. And then you could also go into your assets folder, rename or copy the configuration file. You could use the English and Spanish technique like we just did. And then in your app delegate file, where the application launches, which is right here for this one, you could do the exact same thing, right? What is the configuration file name that I want to use? You could test Android. And incidentally, this brings up a great point. I kind of failed a little bit now that I've thought about this a few times. We can ask the device, the BuzzTouch device class already helps us learn things about the device, like is it connected and what size is the screen and all that kind of stuff. We should probably put in the device class, locale. That way, anywhere in our app, we could say, hey, device, if you're Spanish, do this, or if you're English, do that, but just haven't done it. So I'm going to get rid of Eclipse and go back to Xcode, and we're going to summarize a little bit here what we talked about. We talked about why you have to localize, or what localization is, why I care about it. Is it tough? Is it hard to do? It can be. It just depends on how much stuff you have to translate. What are two approaches? There's lots of approaches. These are two approaches. With dealing with simple little words in our strings file and dealing with content by using a different configuration file. We talked about making an entirely different app. I didn't talk about what do I localize. Sometimes it's not as complicated as you think, but other times it can get complicated. But generally speaking, if it's a picture and not a word, you don't have to worry about it. So on this screen, we would have to have the text on our rows different and the title across the menu bar, but the graphics would remain the same. So I say most cases because that's not always the case. If you tried to make an application, for example, that was localized for the United States and, say, somewhere in the Middle East where the transitions went right to left instead of left to right, we'd have a whole lot more work to do. And now all of a sudden making a different app becomes more maybe a totally more reasonable approach, because you're now talking about logic, right? Which way does it navigate and which way does it translate and all those kinds of things. And so generally speaking, if you can read it, you should translate it. If you can see it, you don't have to worry about it. So images and text is what you localize generally. So I'm going to take the last 20 minutes or so, 15 minutes actually, and we're just going to have a discussion, and we'll start taking questions, Warren, because I could go on and on and on about the complexities of some of the challenges that you'll run into in terms of trying to do too many languages all at once, but it kind of tends to get a little long. So if anybody has any questions, go ahead and raise your hand. I see Miguel's is up.
Right. I've unmuted everybody's microphone, so just take them in order, David, and they should be able to talk to you.
Miguel, I think you're first.
Okay. Okay, David. So I understood everything you told us. So basically, what you suggest is that we create a second app in our BT control panel, and then just copy the BT config file and put it in one project. Is that it?
That is one way that I would recommend if you want to put only one app in the App Store.
Okay, but
there's no difference. The only difference between doing that and putting an entirely different app in the App Store is sometimes you don't want the same application in your developer profile that's really the same thing, and it just tends to confuse people. Because which one do they search for? Which one should they download? So it's in essence doing the same, you're accomplishing the same thing, but only distributing and compiling one app.
Okay, so but I could also do, if it would be easier in some cases, I could also just instead of creating a second app, I could just translate the config file. You know, look it through and just translate what I need to translate, and change the files that I wanted to be loaded differently.
You could do that, but then you'd still only have one, say, Portuguese app.
No, exactly. But and is it no that I understood. That's okay.
Okay.
Is there also a way for you to translate the name of the app that appears in the App Store? You localize the name of the app itself, depending on what App Store that you're viewing it.
You know, that's a great question, and somebody else might be able to help. I've not explored that. That would be in iTunes Connect. When you submit your application and you provide a name, that name, you might be able to change that locale by locale or app store by app store, but I'm not 100% sure. I'm happy to look into that for you.
Yeah,
I do know that the value that shows underneath the icon will be the same, right? Because it's the CF bundle display name.
Yeah.
And again, I'm certainly open for corrections. I may be wrong there, but I believe that the name that shows under the icon, because you're not localizing this plist,
exactly.
will be the same.
Yeah, but it does make sense that it must be somewhere in iTunes Connect because nobody has the app yet. Nobody's downloaded, so there's
right. And think of all the description text and the different categories. Those are all in a different language.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks a lot.
Yeah. So Susan, do you have another question? I see her hand up.
Oh, yeah, I was going to say, that was really interesting about. Oh, yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Anyway, I thought that was really interesting about the having two different config files pointing into one app, and it's kind of a little off topic, but is that a solution to the age-old BuzzTouch problem about whether or not you keep your app connected or not connected? Could you actually create a new config file and then at the last minute actually hook it up?
Well, not really, because, and that's a good question too, but let's go back a little bit and revisit how this thing works, right? Because the first thing that it does, and most people struggle to get their head around this, and it confuses me sometimes too, but try to follow along. The first thing it does is, in an iOS, it's called did finish launching with options, which is where we do all of this. In Android, let's see if I still have it open. The delegate file in Android, it's going to be called... Yeah, and our applications, the only class in our entire project that extends application is our, in essence, launching point. And so this is called a Java constructor when we do this. So what we're doing is we're looking for the name of this file. Okay, so we set a variable called configuration file name. And what we do is we go down here, blah, 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 the code runs, the code runs, the code runs. And you see where it says load app data. Before this method ends, it triggers another method called load app data, which is right here. And basically we're saying, hey, if the configuration file has a URL, data URL right here, if the configuration file that we're using has a URL, then we're going to go get an updated version of this configuration file from that URL. And then we're going to save a cached version, a local version of that file we just downloaded, and we're going to save it to the file system, and we're going to call that cached app config, and this will be on the device. And so your question was, can we somehow publish it and then switch it? And you can't really do that because every single time the app launches, it's going to read the baked-in, compiled-in config data and check to see if a URL is there. And in theory, you could remove everything else here, delete it all, have no screens, no tabs, no nothing, and just only use a data URL. And we've done that before. The problem is if the customer doesn't have internet, the thing won't do anything. So if the customer doesn't have internet when they first install your app, this is the data they're going to get. This is the data that they're going to use, which is why it's so important that it match what's in your control panel when you first submit it for approval, because the first thing that the Apple developer or the customer for that matter is going to do is see what does it do when it's offline, and you want it to work. So
Yeah,
that's why you have all this configuration data there. But you can
that's
change the
true.
file name. So I wouldn't use that approach to try to kind of get around a good design. You know,
Yeah,
we're not using the control panel to try to trick anybody. We're just using the control panel to try to make it easier on us to do content updates.
yeah, yeah, that's true.
So yeah, and a lot of people ask too, well, what if I just used an entirely different configuration file, you know, 2 weeks after my app was approved, and I
Hmm.
totally changed it? Well, you could do that. I mean, the
Hmm.
nature of our back end allows you to change the tabs and the graphics and the, you know, everything about your app, but it kind of goes against the spirit of what we're trying to do and what your end users expect. You know, you don't want to be completely fundamentally changing your app just because you can doesn't mean it's a good idea.
No, I don't think Apple would like that either. If they saw you doing that, they wouldn't like that.
Like it's very clearly stated in their developer policy that, you know, their guidelines that they frown upon that big time.
Yeah,
And so that doesn't mean you can't do it.
yeah.
But yeah, so really what we talked about was how to determine the locale of the device, changing the configuration file name that the device uses, and we might have multiples. You can call these things anything you want, and running with that one and going from there. And we're just going to be changing the URL that it downloads from because we have different versions in our control panels. You know, the report to cloud will be different, the data URL will be different, and something else. I keep changing this up a little bit, but if you have a little simple app, you could kind of sort of easily, you know, see some statistics about what language is being used the most in your app. If let's say you're not using App Annie, or you know, the market does a pretty good job of helping you with that kind of thing. But and maybe that's just not even something we need to talk about. But there's a lot of interesting strategies I can think of that require or support the idea of having multiple configuration files. Anybody else? Leon? I see
Yeah.
his hand still
Um,
up.
yeah, you can hear me, right?
Yes.
No, no, no. Okay. The if language is equal code you just wrote down there with the
Yep.
Spanish thing. That's not the correct code, right? There's something missing, or can I just take that and go with that?
The only thing that's missing there is I don't think iOS reported to us that Spanish or English was literally the word there. I think when we look down in our app here and we look for what language, I believe, yeah, that it printed English United States. So you'd have to do something like this, right? But this works if the language is equal to string this, then that will work just fine. Now the question is do you want like NS locale identifier? You know, that's what we're querying. I would think that it would be easier to query for something like this, like EN, right? Isn't that like the international?
Yeah, that's right. So I
So
can go.
instead of locale identifier, we could probably go to the documents and we could say, you know, I don't want the whole thing. I just want the, let's look at the documents here, class methods, locale identifier from components, preferred languages, right? There's a lot of things we could test for, and I think one of them, system locale might be an object and not a string. But the point is we would ask the locale object for its abbreviation, and it's not locale identifier. It's going to be something else. And I'd have to look it up and find it. But
Yeah,
yeah,
okay.
you
Well,
just
I can look it up, but that's
yeah,
basically it. So if I find the
that's
right way for
basically
that,
it.
then it works.
Yeah, exactly. Because
Okay.
like what? Let's test this. Let's test this just for fun. Let's go to our configuration file and let's set up some tabs here. And this is our English file, right?
Yeah.
Let's go to our Spanish file, and you see how it doesn't have, I've typoed tabs on purpose so we don't have any tabs. I'm going to take our data URL out of here so we don't use the internet just for this example. And I'll take this data URL out. I'm just introducing typos on purpose. So in our English app, we have tabs, 4 of them. In our Spanish app, we have no tabs because the tabs array doesn't exist. I called it something else. And this will be the home screen. So when our app launches, we're saying, I'm just going to comment all this out. We're saying use this file, btconfig-en, use that file as the configuration data. Okay, so we're going to do a couple simple little tests here, and you can see that is the tabbed app. See how this works? Because in the English file, we have 4 tabs. If we go in and we just do this just for a quick little test, and we say, you know what, use this file instead. Use this Spanish file. This is the app that's not going to have any tabs. See there? So now really what we're doing is we've got to say, hey, let's look for the locale, and depending on what the value of this language variable is, switch it to the Spanish or the French. So I don't know what we were looking for here. I think it was Ingles. Oh, let's do it this way. Let's look what iOS found for us. English, United States.
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't switch my language in the simulator. Remember when we switched the language? So you would just have to figure out, you know, what you just test the language on the device, and right now we're English, so you have that happening. But I just demonstrated how 2 different configuration files behaved entirely different. This, you guys might also be asking yourself, and this is kind of cool in my mind, why not a plugin that allows you to switch apps? Right? You got 10 configuration files, 10 apps in your control panel. Why not let the user choose which one they want to look at? Starts to get kind of exciting. Only got a few minutes left, but I've been working on a plugin here that I'm working on with Go Northwest, Mark, where we're literally trying to give you a way to share your apps amongst yourselves in everybody else's app. I know that sounds complicated, but imagine me being able to put my app in your app and you being able to put your app in my app. Sounds kind of fun. So we call that the app launcher, and it definitely goes against the grain of some ideas. We're not trying to reinvent an app store. That's definitely not the purpose. But imagine 6 different locations, for example, of restaurants all managing different apps, but they have one parent app called McDonald's, right? It begins to help you understand why switching apps and switching configuration data could be really, really useful. Or 20 students in a school app, they all have their own. So there's a lot of flexibility in this that people don't really think of. So any other questions?
Yeah, is that going to be done soon?
What was that?
Is that going to be done soon, or is this something that's going to take another month?
Soon's relative. I've been working on it for a while. It's actually in the wild. There are a few different examples of that. In fact, this goes back quite a ways. If you've seen in my little profile, I've got a thrifty car sales app in the market.
Yeah,
I had that for a couple of years. That's one of our car customers from an entirely different business. And a lot of the concepts that come out of a lot of the concepts that you guys see and a lot of the programming approaches that we take are based on real-world examples. And so the example there was they've got dealers all over the United States who need to individually manage their own content, but not individually manage their own, quote, app. And so in the App Store, there's only one app. We call it the Thrifty Car Sales app, and it in essence is kind of the parent app. And then when you launch it, it has a menu of locations. Well, each one of those locations leads to a separate control panel that is managed by the car dealers. So it helped us solve that problem. You've got everybody out there individually managing their own content within one parent thing. And so understanding that idea, very, very, very powerful, but also recognizing that, you know, depending on your approach, horrible idea, right? You could easily reinvent our entire business model by saying, hey, publish your app to the BuzzTouch app or something along those lines. And now you're bucking the system a little bit. You're breaking the rules. We have a wonderful app store out there. It's called the App Store. All of these secondary, you know, aftermarket app store attempts just pale in comparison. It doesn't do anybody any good to list all that kind of stuff in most cases. But for your own private reasons, absolutely do a lot of stuff with those concepts. So we're going to bring this plugin to you. That'll be called the App Launcher. I want to give it to the audience so that we can all share each other's apps to help each other get downloads, not to necessarily load them in the control panel. I can imagine a day where we would all be better off because we're showing off each other's apps in some creative way that doesn't go against Apple's policies, because we're a community, right? We're all helping each other out. So anyway, I'm out. It's noon. Thanks, everybody. It looks like Warren has already signed off or is signing off. And let's make sure and say thanks to him.
I'm still here, David.
Oh, perfect. I didn't realize it's noon right now. So why don't you wrap us up?
Well, first of all, David, thanks once again about
You're welcome.
another on-the-fly presentation that's killer. I'm sure that people are going to get a ton out of it. Tomorrow night, just give me 30 seconds on what we're going to talk about tomorrow night with the control panel presentation.
30 seconds isn't enough. And of course, I got to go back to my app here that I broke. So the control panel, we're going to test these ideas and explore some concepts around the connection between the device, or of course the simulator, and your control panel in terms of how data is rifled back and forth or shuffled back and forth. Web developers will be very comfortable with that, and we're going to talk about the relationship between the database and the back end, the control panel, what it's supposed to do, and the device. And a lot of that ties right nicely into this configuration file we just talked about.
All right. So looking forward to it tomorrow night. I'm not going to dress up for Halloween.
Cool.
So anyway, thanks for everybody that attended. If you're thinking about tomorrow night, please sign up. We've only got 7 people signed up so far for tomorrow night's presentation. And so look forward to seeing you then.
Okay, guys. We'll see you next time. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.